Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 20th of January 2014, David Almond discussed literary experimentation and writing for the young.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's great to be here. Fantastic. What a nice place. I need to move away from that. Yeah, it's great to be here talking about writing and about writing for children and about children's writing. The title of the talk actually came from a boy. I was talking to children about writing, about what happens when you read. And kids are so perceptive. You know, people don't believe this, but you need to go and see some children. But I was talking about stories and about words, and I said to a class of children, and I took some words from a book. I said, what happens when you put the words inside your head? And this boy said, the story dances off the page into your head, doesn't it? Children know this. You know, children are kind of close to the fundamental elements of language. The language is sound and objects and visions. And that's one of the reasons why I love to write for children and to work for children. If I'd said 20 years ago that I'd be standing here talking about writing for children, I would have said, nah, I'll never do that. Because the thought of writing for children seemed kind of marginal to me. It didn't seem something very important at all. I was a teacher at the time, so, you know, I was kind of blinded in lots of ways. I thought, I'm an intelligent grown-up person. I'll write books for intelligent grown-up people. That's what we're supposed to do, isn't it? And that's what I did, or tried to do for lots of years. And so I was a short story writer, first of all. I wrote short stories that were published in little magazines and in small presses. I wrote a novel that took me 5 years to write, and it was a big, chunky novel set in Spittle Tongues. Is anybody from Spittle Tongues? It was set in Spittle Tongues. It had a big feature of, you know, the Castle Leazes and the lake, and I thought it was really good. It took me 5 years to write it, and it was rejected by every single publisher in the country. And then people came to me and they said, now David, it takes you 5 years to write a novel. Nobody wants to publish it. Are you going to do something sensible now? So I said, yeah, I think I'm going to write another book. And they looked at me and said, well, you must be stupid. I thought, I know I must be stupid. And I talked about that to children as well. I say to kids, you know, you imagine when you grow up that everybody feels really grown up and sophisticated and intelligent. But of course, it's a big lie, isn't it? We don't feel like that. And I remember ploughing on as a novelist and people saying, you must be stupid. And I thought, I know I must be stupid, but there's nothing I can do about it. And of course, lots of achievement is to do with kind of facing up to our own stupidity and just cracking on through that. So that novel was rejected by everybody. I kept on writing short stories. By this time, I was running a literary magazine as well called Panage. I ran that for 6 years, a short story magazine. And I learned a lot from doing that about rejection, which is the terrifying thing for authors. I'm sure lots of authors in here have had lots of rejections. But my job as an editor was to reject people. So I got hundreds, thousands of manuscripts every year. And my friend David knows all about this. You receive a manuscript and your job actually is to say no. Very, very rarely you'll say yes, but your job is to say no. And so I was rejecting people while I was getting rejected by all these big publishers as well. And I set off writing another novel. And this novel this time was it was set on Lindisfarne. It was set in the north of England. It was about kind of Christian history and the northern history. And it was set today. It was called The Miracles of St. Cuthbert, because St. Cuthbert and Lindisfarne have always been very important to me as an author. And a couple of things happened at that time. One of them was I'd been writing for about 15 years with a few publications. Now, a handful of people who thought I was really good, and a couple of them are here tonight. Maybe 12 people thought I was really good. And I thought, oh, God, you know, that was good. I was pleased with that. But I hadn't had much success. And I remember walking into Waterstones on Dean Street. Do you remember when Waterstones came to Newcastle? Yeah. It was just revolutionary. 3 floors of books, Waterstones. It was absolutely fantastic. But for the first time, I walked into Waterstones, walked down Dean Street, walked in, sunny afternoon, I remember it vividly. And as I stepped through the door, I looked around the shelves and I thought, you bastards. And I hated them. I hated them all. I hated all these people who were getting published and I wasn't. And I remember going to the table, the table of all these books, and a couple of them I recognised the names, and I picked a couple of them and I looked, and inside a couple of them said in the acknowledgements, "Oh, and thanks to David Almond for publishing my stories in Panage," and I hated them even more. And I thought that's a terrible thing, because if you write, so if you kind of aspire to any kind of artistic thing, despair and envy and bitterness just lie in wait. There's a trough of envy that can swallow us all. So I backed away from that. And then another thing happened. I opened The Guardian, and there inside The Guardian was the interview that you see every year. And there she was. She was very beautiful. She was about 25. And she'd written 6 chapters of her first novel, and she's had a sort of £200,000 advance. We've all seen that, haven't we? Yeah, we've seen that interview. And I hated her. And also I thought, well, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here. No, I don't want to compete with that. I don't want to compete with these people around the shelves. So I thought, what do I really want to do? And I began to write just a whole set of stories about me growing up as somebody very like me, because when you fictionalize yourself, it's not you. About somebody like me growing up in Felling with a family like mine and friends like mine. And there were little kind of insignificant stories about insignificant people doing insignificant things in an insignificant place. And they were written for an audience of 4 people, for my sisters and my brother, because they were about them. And before I set off writing them, I said, well, I'm writing some new stories. Oh, yeah. But I said, this time they're about you. So I got them round, I gave them lots to drink and lots to eat. And then I read a couple of the stories to them, and they said, oh, yeah, that's okay, and kind of try and get these published. And then I started to send them around and get them published. And I found myself getting into magazines that I'd been chasing for years. And there was something that I discovered, we all kind of know intellectually that the local is the universal, that the significant is found in the insignificant. But I experienced that. These little stories began to get published in lots of places and win a couple of prizes. And they were also written from the point of view of a child. And I remember writing them, and I began to re-experience the imaginative and emotional and physical life of a child again, and to write through that. And I found a new way to write these stories. And when I'd finished these stories, I had an agent. And I remember going to the post box, and I put all the stories into the post box to send them away to my long-suffering agent, who had stuck by me all these years. And the last thing she wanted to see, of course, was a collection of unpublished short stories from an unpublished novelist. That was the last. But I thought, there's nothing I can do. So I put these into the post box, and I turned away from the post box. And I was always walking along the street with my head totally empty. I thought, oh yeah, I'm finished. I finished that book. I've sent it off. I'll take some time off from writing now. And I walked about 10 yards away from the post box. And in the back of my head, I found him in the garage on a Sunday afternoon. And it just went, it came with a kind of crackle and a fizz and an energy. And it came from nowhere. It was like somebody was walking along behind me that day and said, here, son, you've been working really hard, and threw it into my head. And it just came with, writers know this energy. When a good idea comes, it just has just such potential. All I had was the first sentence. So I didn't take some time off. I went back to where I was staying at the time. I sat down and I began to write this story. And I got halfway down the first page, and I realized it was a kind of culmination of everything I'd done before. It was the best thing I'd ever done. And I got halfway down the page and I thought, and it's a book for children. And I was totally amazed. I thought I'd never expected to do that. I'd always kind of thought, I'll never do that. But it was an amazing moment, because suddenly I felt liberated, because I didn't have to compete with these people that I hated on the shelves. I didn't have to compete with the beautiful new young novelist. I could just work with this new field, and I had this sense of moving into a new space, which I didn't actually know very much about. A couple of times during the time I was writing this book, which turned out to be called Skellig, I was writing it for 6 months, 7 months. A couple of times I dared to tell somebody, I think I'm writing a children's book. They said, oh yeah, so you've researched the children's book market then, have you? I haven't, So is it filled with sort of contemporary teenage slang and stuff? No, not at all. I knew nothing about it. But I think writing is about doing your best possible story that you can do in the best possible way. And it's about giving space to the thing that drives you to write. If you're driven to write, it's because there's something inside you that's driving out to get written. There's something inside you that's trying to find a space. And when I was writing this book called Skellig, into it came lots of things from my own life, lots of things from my childhood. It was set in Heaton, where we were living at the time, just off Chillingham Road. So it used that house, it used elements of my own history. But also, it just came with a new kind of energy. And I remember writing it, and I thought, oh, I can't write that. But then I thought, oh, but it's for children, so I can. And I had this real sense that you can tell a different kind of truth to people who have got very flexible imaginations, and also to people who know that they don't know everything yet. So I didn't have the sense that I had to be ironic at all, that there was a different kind of statement-led, objective truth about it, and I could just be very direct to say, yes, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, because there was this sense that at the other end of it were children. Nobody knew about this book. It's interesting as well to think now, agents are all looking for the next new children's writer. At that time, which is 16 years ago, Skellig's 15 years old this year, when I sent it to Maggie, my agent, I'd send her the book of short stories, and she said her heart just sank with that. A book of short stories, David. And then I sent her a children's novel, because I hadn't told her I was writing a children's novel. And she said, this was after, she said, when that arrived, we just thought, oh, what are we doing with this mad nut from, the northeast? They were about to ditch me. They thought, well, maybe we should try and advise them to go somewhere else, because nobody was looking for children's books at the time. But then they took the book home and, fell in love with it. And then it went to the first publisher, and the first publisher that saw it just grabbed it and asked for more. So it was a kind of huge lesson for me, and I think an interesting lesson especially for young writers. You never know what kind of book you're going to write. If you try and tell yourself too early what kind of writer you're going to be, you're going to make a big mistake. You have to write in a kind of condition of really not knowing very much at all, and in a condition of kind of unpredictability. And I look back now and I can kind of see a route that led to Skellig, but actually, when I was in the midst of ploughing that route, I didn't have a clue. You don't know. And I think not knowing is a really important thing about any kind of artistic creation. So I kind of knew about the sentences I was writing at the time, but the overarching thing I didn't know. I didn't know what the story of Skellig was. I didn't know how it was going to end up, and I didn't know how to be a children's writer. And I think that's really kind of interesting. And also, I'd gone through the period of feeling stupid. I think it's really interesting to feel stupid as well. So not knowing, feeling stupid, and being dogged and just sticking it out and having a thick skin, taking no notice of people who say you can't do this thing. You think, well, yes, I can. But I'll write something that I didn't really expect. So when Skellig was grabbed by the first publisher that saw it, and even in the sort of 6 months leading up to publication of Skellig, there was lots of fuss about it. And I found myself in this world that I'd never known existed, the children's book world. And which had always seemed to me, there was always children's book departments in the shops, there was children's book departments in the library. But I suddenly found myself in this world, which was actually astonishing. And when Hot Air took Skellig, one of the first things they did was to send me to a librarians conference in Edinburgh. And I thought, oh God, that's going to be exciting, isn't it? A librarians conference. And I'd been a teacher. I was a teacher at the time, and I knew about teachers' conferences where people like moan a lot and drink a lot. And I went to this conference. It was absolutely extraordinary. I don't know if there's any librarians in the room today. I was overwhelmed by this librarians conference in Edinburgh. People were coming to me with eyes glowing, with a passion about books and a passion about getting books to children. A whole world that I didn't know was there. And you were kind of welcomed with open arms. It was quite extraordinary. And these people, their whole lives were dedicated to getting books to children. And also I found myself in a world where publishers were just astonishing. Publishers would take big risks. Publishers were really creative. They wouldn't fling big advances at people like they would at this, this lovely young woman. They just looked after our literary culture and made sure that children received the kind of the products of, these great minds, these great artists and great writers that are working inside the children's book world. And I met astonishing writers and astonishing artists who were doing extraordinary stuff that was kind of really blanked off from a lot of the world. So I'd come from a kind of what I thought was, the mainstream adult literary culture, trying to somehow find a way into it. And then I entered this other place, which really did seem to be like the beating heart of where all this started. And it really did seem to be where where literature, where stories really found their heart. And when I got there, I thought, well, why is it like this? And I think, in the 70s, I was really interested in sort of experimental fiction and in concrete poetry and stuff, which was always kind of marginal and happened in lots of little small presses. But if you go into a children's book department, it's all going on there. The experimentalism of children's literature is just astounding. I brought a few books along today. One of my favourite books at the moment is a book called Peck, 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 which has got holes in. And you look at that. You say to a child, why has that book got holes in? Oh, because it's about a woodpecker. If this was published for adults, it would be seen as a kind of, this kind of strange postmodern artifact. But kids, 3 and 4 year old kids, just, they accept all this. It's quite extraordinary, because it's not extraordinary. They just accept stories in all kinds of forms. There are great, wonderful artists and writers like Oliver Jeffers. Oliver Jeffers is a picture book artist. He's a painter as well as being an illustrator. Does extraordinary stuff with text and pictures working together. And a few years ago there was a big fuss about crossover books, and we imagined that crossover books must be kind of things about really kind of profound adult-led issues for sort of 15 and 16-year-olds. Actually, in many ways, the true crossover books are picture books that are really beautiful objects, which are beautifully written, and which a parent and a child share together. And I think that thing about sharing is really important as well. Writing for children, you're reminded that actually words on a page begin here. Words on a page begin on the voice. Words are a physical thing. And when we get into the realms of kind of thinking about high literature, we forget that that's where language starts. Language starts on the tongue, on the voice, in the body. It echoes through the body. Children know this instinctively, and parents know it when they tell stories to children. You don't just share a story through the communication and through the brain, you share it through the body. And kids are great about this, because I do more and more events with children and adults together, and at the end of each of those events, I know what's going to happen. The adults will come to me and say, that was amazing. How did those children know that thing? How did they know how to ask these questions? Because children really are close to the elemental nature of language. One of the things that people like Oliver Jeffers does, or so many writers. Here's a great masterpiece, great world-shattering masterpiece, Where the Wild Things Are. The thing that children understand as well is the fact of words being objects, words being things. And when I got into this world and I thought back to how I began to learn to read and how I began to learn to write, I remember when I was a little boy in Felling in St. John's Primary School, and Mrs. Fagan was teaching us how to read and how to write. And magical moments when she was standing in front of the blackboard, and I remember, she had lovely hands, she had a long stick of white chalk, and she would make the shapes of letters on the blackboard. So she'd make the shape, and she'd go, th, and we'd all go, th. And then she'd go, t, and we'd all go, t. And I remember the beautiful connection between the shape of the word, her voice, and us repeating it. So the beauty of letters, the beauty of words, is something that children are really, really close to. And as a writer, that's something that I love as well. One of the things I love about writing is just that, black print on white paper. I think it's truly gorgeous. And in the children's book world, that's what people are really connected to, how words look on the page. It's like poetry. I talk a lot to picture book writers. I've written one picture book in 15 years, and I keep trying to write more, but that's so hard. It's like writing a poem. It's like writing a successful poem, because everything has to work, and you have to make the whole thing a unit that's going to work, and it's truly, truly difficult. And it is about getting the words correctly placed on the page. I love that. I love the way language looks on the page. I love the way it works. It's like, it really is a kind of elemental. Also, it's a playful thing. When we look at books on shelves, it looks very kind of serious and very grown up and very kind of perfect and very, very adult. And of course it is, it is very adult. But also, good books come from a very kind of playful, childlike process. And what I love about writing as well, I love the finished thing. I love the fact that people will come along and say, oh, that's really clever. Look what that David Almond can do. But what I love as well is, I love highlighters. I love working with highlighters. I love biros with 4 colours in. I love notebooks, it's lovely. And I go into schools and I say, who likes highlighters? Oh, we love highlighters. Who likes Sharpies? Sharpies, beautiful things. The things that we use to make books, no matter how kind of adult and how sophisticated they become, I think the kind of playful nature of writing is something that I love, and I think all writers love, really. And I think you can't write successfully unless you're willing to go back to being playful. So my notebooks are very messy, very scratchy. They end up looking kind of perfect. But the perfection of a book, the kind of grown-upness of a book, is a kind of illusion. The illusion's given by publishers. And publishers, when manuscripts arrive at their desk, they spend months making sure that all the prints in place, everything's right, the card's right, there are no mistakes in it, it's beautifully set out. So when it comes out, it looks like a perfect object. But of course, perfection is impossible. The reason that we create it all is because we are imperfect. We're imperfect beings in an imperfect world. And kids know that. So kids play. And the imperfect process of playing is where it all begins for me. And that's what I love about children's books. It's being in that place where language kind of matters in a very kind of almost like a physical sense. The book I really love is this one. It's called The Law and Language of School Children by Iona and Peter Opie. And all it is, they went around, it's quite an old book now, in the 50s and 60s, and just collected children's chants and children's spells and children's songs, because that's what kids do with language, isn't it? They play with it and they turn it into songs. I was in London just the other night. I was walking down towards the embankment, and the London Eye was on the other side, and there was a little girl walking down beside me with her family, and she just suddenly jumped up and said, I can see the London Eye and it's not moving. So she turned it into a song, and as she was doing it, she was skipping along as well, and she turned a sentence into something that was really beautiful, because that's what children do, and that's what the Obies recognise. And I think that's what children's authors and children's illustrators recognise. And it's also what's kind of recognised inside the children's book world. Sometimes, one thing that really kind of just bores me stiff is when you talk to adults who are very pessimistic about our culture, about literary culture and about our culture generally. And I think actually what you need, mate, is to go and see some children. I go to a lot of schools and I meet loads of kids. And people say to me, what do you do? And I say, well, I write books for children. Oh, yeah, kids don't read anymore, do they? And I say, God, how boring. Go and see them. The world's being changed by children. These kids are grown up. I mean, we've got some people from a fantastic school in the West End of Newcastle here tonight. The kids from these places are going to change the world. And when you look at the people who kind of have a pose of representing them, a pose of being kind of politically responsible for them, these kids who are grown up in our society that we often ignore, these kids are going to just shatter this world and change it totally. When you look at somebody like Michael Gove, some of his attitudes towards the people he's supposed to represent, I think it's quite disgraceful, actually. And what he needs to do is actually learn from the kids that he is supposed to be in some way representing. I think it's a very kind of cynical kind of abuse of power by people when they do get into power, especially when they're dealing with children. There are fantastic teachers around, there are fantastic kids who are going to kind of change this world and make it much more interesting. When people say literary culture is dead, I saw an interview recently with Martin Amis, and he said this thing that I thought was disgraceful. He said, oh, any author worth their salt thinks that culture is always reaching its nadir. And he said, any writer just knows that innocence is irretrievably lost. I think, how boring is that? How deeply, deeply boring and offensive that is. If you go into the children's book world, you talk to children's writers, children's illustrators, talk to teachers, talk to librarians, they don't believe that. They don't believe that at all. I was talking to a children's writer yesterday and we said, well, why we're in this world. It's because we're surrounded by people who actually believe that culture can be constantly recreated, because there are people always coming up who will produce, new works of art, and we're working among people who are natural artists. And it's not some kind of West Coast, yeah, man, all kids are natural artists. They are. I go into schools and I say, who writes? Oh, yeah, I write. Who writes songs? I write songs. Who dances? I dance. Who likes doing drama? I like doing drama. Who draws? Who paints? They just do this naturally. And you think, well, it's very romantic. Kids grow up and they get this stuff knocked out of them. They don't all get it knocked out of them. And so I'm kind of very optimistic, really. Yeah? And as I say, I've got some friends from school there who are there are amazing things going on in schools. Don't believe what you see, what you hear in the media. So be optimistic. Go and see some children. Go into the schools. I'll just read a little bit to you now, and then you can ask me some questions. My books, I found an ability to be... I work with all kinds of illustrators. One of the great things about writing for children is you can do this kind of thing. This book is a book with the great artist Dave McKean. I've done 3 books now with Dave McKean. And in the adult book world, there's no real place to do this kind of thing, to make this kind of collaboration. So I love collaborating. I love working in the theatre. I love working with illustrators. You couldn't do all that in the adult book world. In the children's book, there's a kind of great kind of liberation and people who will allow you to do this stuff. So I'll read a bit from Mouse, Bird, Snake, Wolf, and then you can ask me some questions. Yeah. This began as a story that I read years ago by Borges, and I wanted to rewrite it, so I found a way of rewriting this Borges story as a kind of graphic novel. Long ago and far away, in a world rather like this one, and with people in it rather like us, there were 3 children, Harry, Sue, and Ben. Ben was known as Little Ben because he was so small. Like many worlds, the world they lived in was a marvelous place filled with marvelous things. Excuse me. I've just started wearing glasses. I keep forgetting. That's a marvelous thing. It was safe and calm and rather wonderful, but it was a strange old place as well. There were gaps and holes in it. There were places where there seemed to be nothing at all, places that were filled with emptiness. Some of these were huge as desert, some were no bigger than a fingernail. The trouble was, the gods who had made the world had become rather fat and rather too pleased with themselves. Oh yes, they had worked great wonders in days gone by. They had made mighty mountains, tender flowers, rivers, forests and seas. They had made astounding animals, the elephant, the camel, the whale, and man and woman, of course, and babies and children, and beasts that in our world we have no name for. But now they spent their day after day, lying on their clouds, sipping tea and nibbling sandwiches and cakes. They chatted about their creation and gazed down at them with deepest fondness. "Your elephant, sir, is a thing of wonder," one would say to another. "Ah, yes, indeed, but what about your chain of mountains and your sparkling ponds and streams?" "But each time I see your wisteria, my eyes fill with tears, such restraint, such delicacy. Oh, and those sweet daisies. But your humpback whale, such magnificence, and your extraordinary sowet, your gazelle, oh, but your brant." And they would shrug and blush and lower their eyes. They'd be silent for a time, and then they'd say, "Could any other gods come up with anything more astonishing?" And in their smiles they'd answer, "No, there are no other worlds like this one. There are no other gods like us. We are indeed the best of all gods in the best of all worlds." And so they lay on their clouds and floated through the sky and took tea and slept and snored. And they did tell each other what they would make once they got back to work, if only they had the energy, if only they had the time. But in truth, their world was still unfinished and still had many gaps and holes in it, and there was still much making to be done. One day, Harry, Sue and Little Ben decided to go wandering. Not too far, just past through the fields and woods around their homes. They walked on walls, climbed over fences, jumped across streams, swung from trees. They dared one another to dash and leap through empty spaces, which could be a little scary, but great fun. After a while, they lay down on soft turf beneath a gnarled old tree and beside a sparkling stream, and they rested. And all of a sudden, Little Ben said in surprise, as if he'd never thought of it before, "This is a very peculiar world. He looked up at the clouds. "Why are there so many gaps and spaces in it?" he said. The gods took no notice. "It needs more things in it," he said. Still no notice. Little Ben sighed. "Have you ever looked into an empty space?" he said to his friends. "Of course we have." "Sometimes," said Ben, "when you look into an empty space, you can kind of see something in it." "Something in an empty space," said Harry. "Yes," said Ben. "You can kind of see what's missing from it." "Like what?" asked Harry. "Like a mouse." "A mouse," said Harry. "What on earth is a mouse?" "I don't quite know," said Ben. He wrinkled his nose and scratched his head. "It's a kind of mousy thing, I suppose." Harry shook his head. Sue rolled her eyes. "Yes," said Ben, "it's a mousy thing. It's a funny little squeaky scampery thing." "Then it's just like you," said the others. "Yes," laughed Ben, and he thought of a mouse inside himself. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll show you what one looks like. Watch." He glanced up in the sky. The gods weren't looking. He got some wool and some petal and some nuts and made the shape of a mouse with them. He laid it in the grass. "Squeak and scamper, little mouse," he whispered. "Come along, don't be shy, squeak and scamper." The children laughed. They didn't really believe that the mouse would squeak and scamper, but as they watched, it started to tremble and shake. "Look," they cried, "what a lovely little thing it is." The mouse started to its feet. It sniffed the air. It peeped into the sky with its little bright eyes. It squeaked and squeaked and squeaked again and scampered right away. The children clapped their hands. "It seemed quite at home," they said. Ben giggled. "At last," he said, "this is a world with a mouse in it, thanks to me." And the children lay on the grass and thought of the mouse running through the fields and forests and the empty spaces and through their minds, and they were very pleased. And the gods, they hardly seemed to stir at all.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.